Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're taking a look at what may have been the greatest victory of a man who some have called the greatest general of all time. That's right, today we're going back to the Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander of Macedon, whom you may know as Alexander the Great, defeated Darius III of the Achaemenid Persian Empire for what turned out to be the last time. But before we get into that, I need to make a recommendation to you. This time it's a podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. Now, if you're a history fan like me, you probably already know about Dan. He and Mike Duncan are the OGs, the undisputed heavyweight champions of historical podcasting, the ones all the rest of us aspire to one day maybe polish their boots. If, on the other hand, you've never heard of Dan, you need to go to the link in the show notes and go give him a listen. Not now. Please don't go until we finish this war story, because if you do, you may never make it back here. But after I've had a chance to tell you today's war story, head over there and check him out. Dan's podcast is particularly interesting right now if you're interested in Alexander the Great. His current series is called Mania for Subjugation, and it's all about Alexander. But Dan doesn't publish on a schedule, and he doesn't stick to any kind of a time limit. He digs deep into his subject. He releases his episodes when they're damn well ready, and he talks as long as he has material. His most recent episode is almost 4 hours long, and he released it about 6 months after the last one. So if you dive in, pack a lunch. It is well worth your time. So, yeah, that's Dan Carlin. But we're not here to talk about Dan. We're here to talk about Alexander. But just like always, before we can do that, we need to talk about where he came from. Because none of us does it on our own, not even Alexander the Great. His success was the product of lots of different factors altogether. The culture he came from, the resources available to him, his education, his family, and his own talents, and of course the enemies he chose to face. So we're going to look at the Macedonians first. Now, Dan Carlin has pretty well convinced me that the people we call the Macedonians probably would have called themselves something that sounded more like Macedonians. I'm going to stick with the more familiar pronunciation, Macedonians, just to keep things simple. But I might slip once or twice. Just remember that Macedonians and Macedonians are the same people. Clear as mud? Anyway, the Macedonians may have considered themselves Greeks, and they were culturally Greeks. But the Greeks of Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Corinth did not consider the Macedonians Greeks. They were a little like the Texans of ancient Greece. They thought of themselves as better than the rest of the Greek city-states, but the rest of the Greeks really didn't want to hang out with them. To the Greeks, they were barbarians, not much more civilized than the Thracians who lived to their north and east, and probably less civilized when it came down to it than the Persians the Greeks had fought at Marathon and Thermopylae and Plataea. And they were allied with the Persians, at least somewhat, during the Persian invasions of Greece. One of the missions of the Persian invasion in 492 BCE, the one led by Mardonius, was to make sure Thrace and Macedonia remained vassal states to the Persian Empire. Maybe not technically part of the empire, but allied with it, and even willing to provide troops when Darius and Xerxes demanded them. But the Persian yoke probably didn't sit easy on the Macedonians' necks. When the survivors of Mardonius' army retreated after the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, the Macedonians may have encouraged them on their way with ambushes and harassing attacks. At any rate, after that army retreated past the Hellespont, the strait of water we call the Dardanelles today, the Persians never tried to come back and retake Thrace or Macedon. So the Macedonians pretty much did their own thing for the next century or so. They fought the Thracians on and off, and they fought the Greeks occasionally, but Mostly they raised horses and kept to themselves. The horses are going to be important later, so remember that part. During this period, the Macedonian armies would have looked a lot like the Athenian army, or the Theban army, or the Corinthian. They were hoplites, heavy infantry supported by peltasts, light infantry, usually armed with javelins or slings. Macedonians would have relied on cavalry more than the Greek city-states did because their territory was better suited to raising horses than the Greek peninsula was, with rolling hills and plenty of grass instead of mountains and rocks. And that's how things continued until about 359 BCE, when a guy named Philip II came to the Macedonian throne. But before we talk about him, let's talk about the Persians. The Persian Empire, which you may also hear called the Achaemenid Empire, rose out of what's now southern Iran when a king called Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great, decided to start conquering his neighbors in about 559 BCE. By the time he died in 530 BCE, he called himself the King of Kings, and he deserved it. He had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen, encompassing all of Mesopotamia, Central Asia east to Afghanistan and north to the Aral Sea, and all of Anatolia. His son Cambyses II added Egypt and Cyprus to the empire, and his successor Darius II pushed the borders out even farther, east all the way to the Indus River and west into Europe. It was Darius that added Thrace and Macedon to the Achaemenid Empire and tried to add the Greek city-states but couldn't quite make it happen. So how did they do it? And why couldn't they beat the Greeks? Well, that's not entirely clear, but Cyrus's army probably used more archers than any other army before him. Not only that, but the Persians seem to have been shameless about incorporating the strengths of the armies they defeated into their own. So by the time Darius invaded Greece, he had cavalry at his disposal from the Central Asian steppe, as well as elephants from India and chariots from Babylonia. What he didn't have was a force of heavy infantry that could stand against the Greek hoplites. Every Asian army the Persians had faced would have been armed and armored similarly to them, which is to say more or less lightly armored with leather or linen, light shields, and short spears that could double as heavy javelins in a pinch. Faced with a barrage of arrows followed closely by an infantry charge at close quarters, they would have had a hard day. The Greeks, by contrast, had stumbled into a military tradition that was almost perfectly suited to defeating the Persian fighting style. Where the Persians liked to soften up their enemy with arrows before charging, the Greeks preferred to dispense with the foreplay and just get after it. The Greek hoplite wore bronze armor on his chest and his lower legs, and a helmet that enclosed his entire head, and he carried a 3-foot round shield made out of wood covered in bronze sheathing. His weapon was an 8 or 9 foot spear, heavy enough to punch through most types of armor a Persian adversary might have worn. And he fought in a formation called a phalanx. Hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping so one man's shield protected him and the guy to his left, and their spears sticking out over the seams at the top of the shields. A hoplite in a phalanx was damn near invincible to any threat from his front. And when the phalanx advanced, it would have acted as what the 20th century historian John Keegan called a plow of flesh, just carving through anything that wasn't another phalanx. At Marathon, the Greek phalanx pretty much ignored the Persian storm of arrows, closing the gap at a run and crashing into the Persian lines before it could get itself ready. Even at Thermopylae, where the Persians won the battle, the victory came at a huge cost. So after the Greeks beat the second Persian invasion at Plataea in 479 BCE, the Achaemenids pretty much just threw up their hands and decided these fuckers just weren't worth the trouble. And for 100 years or so, the King of Kings ignored the Greeks, and the Greeks ignored the Achaemenids, and everybody was happy. And then Philip II took the throne of Macedon and fucked it up for everybody. Now, it doesn't make sense to discount Alexander's achievements. He's the one who conquered the greatest empire the world had ever seen, after all. And he did it in about 3 years, even less time than it had taken Cyrus to build it in the first place. Well, he and 50-some-odd thousand of his closest friends. Spoiler alert, by the way. But if Philip hadn't done what he did, Alexander probably would have been taken out by a coalition of Greek city-states, because it was Philip's military innovations in equipment, tactics, and logistics that made Alexander's fighting style so irresistible. So Philip II became king of Macedon in about 359 BCE. He was actually the third son of his father, King Amyntas III. A lot had to go sideways in order for him to become king, so let's take a look at that, because it looks like being king of Macedon may have been a little bit hazardous to your health. So Amyntas III came to the throne at the end of the second succession crisis in 50 years. And 5 years after he took power, he was driven out for a year by a dude named Griess II. But he got the throne back, and to his credit, things seem to have calmed down a little bit after that. So either he came to power and immediately took out all his rivals Godfather style, or there was nobody left to make a claim against him. Or maybe a little bit of both. But the rest of his reign was fairly stable, at least by Macedonian standards, and he died after 13 more years in about 370 BCE, leaving the throne to his son, Alexander II, Philip's older brother. And the wheels fell off again. Alexander was assassinated in 368 BCE, and the crown passed to his younger brother, Perdiccas III. But Perdiccas was still a kid, so his brother-in-law Ptolemy served as regent for 3 years, until Perdiccas got rid of him, again, Godfather style. Now, Ptolemy was smart enough to send Philip as a hostage to Illyria after his brother Alexander was killed, then later to Thebes. After all, you don't want the entire royal family in one place when things are as volatile as they were in Macedon in the 360s BCE. And this actually speaks well of Ptolemy's intentions here. It seems like it would have been easy to arrange accidents for Perdiccas and Philip and take the throne for himself permanently. But instead he got Philip the hell out of harm's way, or as far as he could anyway. Of course, he was a hostage, held captive politely against the Macedonians' good behavior. If Ptolemy had started stirring up shit against his neighbors, they would have killed Philip by way of penalty. But instead, starting around the age of 14, Philip got some proper military training from a guy called Epaminondas, the Theban general who was at least partly responsible for raising Thebes to a prominent position among the Greek city-states. So it was under Epaminondas that he learned how to organize and supply a proper military campaign, and probably started to develop his own ideas about how to win a war. So Perdiccas recalled Philip to Macedon in 364 after he'd gotten Ptolemy out of the way. And in 359, Perdiccas marched out to battle against the Illyrians and didn't come back. Before he left, he had named Philip his regent to rule on behalf of Perdiccas' son, Amyntas IV, until Amyntas was old enough to rule on his own. But Amyntas was a baby, or maybe a toddler, and Philip had things he wanted to do. So by the end of the year, Philip was king in his own right. And Philip had been paying attention, not just to Epaminondas, but also to the complete shit show of Macedonian politics. He knew what he had to do to secure Macedon's future. He had to make it invincible. And in order to do that, he had to be invincible. So he started building a new army. After a couple of early victories with the force he had, he started making improvements. First, he built a sense of pride and professionalism among his soldiers, promoting promising young leaders based on their skills rather than their heritage. He started paying bonuses for exemplary service and courage. He increased the amount of training his soldiers received. He gave young men reasons to want to serve other than just the promise of fame and glory, although those were definitely motivators as well. and he changed the way they were armed. See, everybody in the Greek world was fighting in tight groups with shields and pointy sticks. So he took the logical next step. He made the pointy stick longer. Where the Greek phalanx that worked so well against the Persians carried the dory, a 9-foot heavy spear, he armed his guys with a spear called the sarissa, which was about twice as long. And he beefed up his phalanx to a 16 by 16 man square, instead of 8 men deep by however many wide the city-states were using. Now, changing the weapon dictated a few changes to other equipment too. See, if your spear is sticking out twice as far in front of you as the other guys, it's going to be hard for him to reach you. So Macedonian infantry didn't need such big shields. So he shrank the shields down from 3 feet across to about 2. And he added a loop to the shield that allowed a guy to sling it around his neck, which allowed him to use his left arm to stabilize the shield instead of supporting it, which allowed him to put both hands on his weapon, which would have been handy with an 18-foot spear, as you can imagine. That increased length also allowed the ranks behind the front to stick their spears out past the front rank, so instead of 1 row of shields and 1 row of spears, the Macedonian phalanx now had 5 rows of spears sticking out past the front line. And with that many pointy sticks out in front of the phalanx, the hoplite, who the Macedonians now called a pejateroi, and hopefully that's the last time I'm going to have to mispronounce that one. Anyway, the soldier could wear less heavy armor. They kept their helmets, but bronze cuirasses gave way to layered linen, which ironically gave almost as good protection for much less weight. But the decreased weight allowed the phalanx to move faster, which made them less vulnerable to arrows. And the sarissas of the rear ranks, held over the heads of the front ranks, actually would have deflected some of the arrows an enemy that relied on archers might send their way. An enemy like, say, the Persians? Not that Philip was thinking about them at all. And while he was busy not thinking about the Persians, he also improved his cavalry, building what might have been the first proper heavy cavalry arm in the world, the companions. These were elite soldiers who started their military training around the age of 14, each one partnering long-term with a single horse, learning first to ride and care for their horses, then to care for each other, and then to bring the thunder against whatever poor motherfuckers happen to be lined up on the opposite end of the field. Because the companion cavalry was capable of true shock effect, and we're not entirely sure how they did it, because these guys were riding horses in an age before stirrups or even saddles. They rode on blankets. They had long spears, almost as long as medieval lances, but without stirrups, they would have had no way to couch those lances and really drive into a rank of infantry. Now, a horse can physically plow through 2 or 3 ranks of infantry as long as they don't have pointy sticks ready to skewer him. But the risk to the horse is not insignificant, and plowing through an 8-rank phalanx just isn't feasible unless the horse and rider are both suicidal. But you can play chicken with them. And I don't care who you are, if a horse is hauling ass in your direction, you're probably going to move. And if he has a crazy sumbitch with a spear on his back, you're definitely going to move. And if he's one of 100 crazy sumbitches, yeah, you and the guys next to you and the guys behind you are all going to move. So that's probably the kind of shock effect we're talking about here. And against light cavalry that's not trained to stand against you, you don't even have to worry about running into them. Just get within sticking distance. And most of the Greek city-states didn't even use cavalry except for scouting and harassment. Surely Philip wasn't thinking about going up against the Persians who used all kinds of cavalry. No, of course not. Oh, wait. He totally was, because Philip recognized a fundamental truth about people. If you give them a common enemy, they're less likely to fight among themselves. One of the reasons he was spending so much time and money building his invincible army was because he figured it was high time the Greeks finished what they started way back at Marathon. And if he could do that, he figured, maybe the Greeks would stop calling him a damn barbarian. But first, he had to get the rest of the Greeks behind him, which was the other reason he had built his invincible army. He started by consolidating his power within Macedon, then turned his attention outward. He conquered Thessaly to the south, then Thrace and Molosia to his north, west, and east. By about 342 BCE, he controlled the territories of modern-day Albania, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria. Everything north of Greece proper was his. So now it was the Greeks' turn. And at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, he showed them whose was bigger, and they agreed to follow his lead. And Philip was finally free to shift his attention to the east. So in 336, he started getting ready to move against the Achaemenids. And here's where we finally start talking about Alexander. Because Philip didn't know it yet, but his chapter of the story was about to come to an end. Now, Alexander was born in about 356 BCE to Philip's fourth wife, Olympias. You could write a whole book about her, and plenty of folks have, casting her as everything from an ambitious and loving mother to a conniving monster. The truth, like always, is somewhere in the middle and probably lost to us. But she was Alexander's mother and a huge influence on his life. And her ideas of the kind of king he should be had a profound effect on him. It says something about how serious Philip was about making Macedon part of the Greek world that he had Aristotle come up from Greece to educate his son. Yes, that Aristotle, the philosopher who was already famous in his own time, probably grumbled at first about going up to Macedon to tutor some half-wit barbarian king's boy. But Philip made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and he pretty quickly realized Alexander was no dumbass. The boy learned fast and fell in love with Homer, whose stories were already ancient by then. He especially loved the Iliad and felt a special kinship with the invincible hero Achilles. There's a legend that Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, but the way books were put together in his day, the story wouldn't have looked like a paperback book, but more like a wooden box full of scrolls. So we're going to have to call bullshit on that one. Honestly, the stories about Alexander's youth read like a suburban mother's fantasy on shrooms, and he probably had a hand in crafting them when he was an adult, with a little help from Olympias, of course. So we can't really take them all that seriously. But we know he chose a horse named Bucephalus, who was supposedly untrainable until he met Alexander, to be his partner as he learned to fight with the companion cavalry. And he and Bucephalus were going to war together by the time Alexander was about 16. And he showed his talent for war pretty much from his first time out. Even without his dad there, he started racking up victories, first in Thrace, then in Macedon, against an Illyrian invasion. You kind of get the sense that the powers around Macedon had started to get the word that this fractured kingdom maybe wasn't so fractured anymore, that maybe it was about to become a serious threat and they needed to nip it in the bud before it could get too big for them to handle. Unfortunately for them, they had already missed their opportunity. Probably when Philip took the throne, but certainly by the time Alexander took the field with his own army behind him. See, there are two general types of great military leaders. Those who learn their skills by hard knocks, and those who are born to lead troops in war. In the first group, you've got guys like Marsilii II, Pyrrhus of Epirus, maybe Dwight Eisenhower. In the second group, you got guys like Thutmose III, Napoleon Bonaparte, Erwin Rommel, George Patton, and Alexander. I mean, drop this guy anywhere else in history, and I'm sure he excels. But at the head of the army his father had just spent the last couple of decades building up, he's going to shake the world. Philip had built a professional, disciplined army and equipped it with the best tools he could come up with. And now Alexander is going to show it how to dance. So Alexander marched south into Greece with his dad in 338 BCE, and he commanded the left wing of the army at the Battle of Chaeronea. There he showed off what would become one of his favorite tactics, riding his companions through a gap in the Greek lines while Philip kept the infantry busy. So they won that battle, and the Macedonians took control of most of Greece, and Philip pretty much immediately said, okay, now we've got that settled, let's go see about the Persians. And he sent a general named Parmenion with 10,000 guys across to Asia Minor in 336 BCE to start riling up the Ionian Greeks against the Achaemenids. And that, unfortunately, is one of the last things Philip did. Because in October of that same year, one of his own bodyguards stuck his sword in Philip's side. The other bodyguards ran after him and killed him rather than capturing him. So we don't know why he did it. There's been plenty of speculation over the last 2,300 years, of course, and there's a pretty popular theory that Olympias had it done because she was ready for Alexander to be in charge. Maybe with Alexander's knowledge, and maybe not. He and Philip had certainly had their rocky spells, just like any other father and son who carried swords around and commanded armies. But it could have been half a dozen other players. One of the Greek city-states could have ordered the hit, thinking they might get their city back. Or Darius III, the new Achaemenid king of kings, might have ordered it to keep Philip from invading. Or another Macedonian noble could have done it. We've already established that being king of Macedon wasn't the safest occupation, even though Philip held the gig longer than most of his predecessors. So we don't know why, but the king is dead. Long live the king. It's time for the world to find out what Alexander can do. And the first people who are going to find that out are the Greeks. Because being the gentle, cooperative people they were, the first thing the Greeks did when they learned Philip was dead was to rebel. Most of them claiming that their oaths were to Philip, not to Macedon. Well, Alexander didn't waste time arguing. He grabbed 3,000 of his companion cavalry and rode south, not even waiting for his infantry. And here's where we start to see an uncanny ability to move in a direction his enemy didn't expect, and to do it faster than anybody imagined he could. The first army he ran into was the Thessalians, but he saw them before they saw him. And before they knew he was nearby, he had ridden his cavalry around to their rear. So the Thessalians said, "Hey, boss, great to see you down here. Did you hear what those jackass Athenians are saying about you?" So he added the Thessalians to his own army and rode south to Corinth, where the Athenians were trying to get the rest of the Greek city-states on board with their plan to revolt against this young whippersnapper. They changed their tune when they woke up one morning to find the Macedonians formed up and ready to throw down outside the city walls. And Alexander graciously accepted their recognizing him as the HMFIC just like his father. Then he turned around and headed up to secure his northern border. So by the end of 335, he controlled everything south of the Danube River and east of the Adriatic Sea. And he turned around and the Greeks were in revolt again. So he marched back south, and this time he decided no more Mr. Nice Guy. He marched his army to Thebes, destroyed it, and calmly asked if anybody else wanted to negotiate. When nobody did, he collected everybody's armies, left a regent in charge, and headed east. And with an army of about 48,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, he crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE. But he couldn't just thrust into the heart of the empire looking for Darius, hoping to end the war in a single battle. That kind of offensive can work sometimes, but against an enemy that's still powerful and in possession of a vast land empire, it's a shitty idea. Because your enemy doesn't have to fight you. He can just get out of your way, then swing around behind you and cut your supply lines and wait for your army to starve to death, or more likely mutiny and try to make their own way home when they figure out you can't feed them. We're going to see some Roman armies try that kind of thing in the same part of the world here in a few centuries, and it's going to work out about as well as you'd expect. And it's not like Darius didn't have a huge, well-equipped army that was fully capable of standing against anything Alexander could throw at it. Well, I mean, it turned out he didn't, but nobody knew that in 334. The King of Kings probably commanded at least 200,000 or 300,000 soldiers, infantry similar to what the Greeks had faced 150 years earlier under Darius I and Xerxes. A little lighter than the Greek hoplites, but still formidable. And the Achaemenids had learned from their experience against the phalanx, and now they had their own hoplites. Greek mercenaries who had decided fighting for the most powerful man in the world was a damn good way to make their own fortunes. He had what the ancient historians call seathed chariots, with some kind of blades fixed to their wheel hubs or maybe the frames that they could use to cut through enemy infantry. We don't know exactly what they looked like or how the Persians used them, but they sound pretty formidable. And he had proper cavalry from all over his empire, which included parts of Central Asia, which has always produced great cavalry. These guys would have fought in a similar manner to the companions, closing with their enemy and thrusting with their spears. And the Persians also had something most of the Greeks and Macedonians had never gone up against: elephants, the ultimate heavy cavalry. And all these guys had archers backing them up, but not nearly as many archers as Darius and Xerxes had brought 150 years earlier. It looks like archers have become much less important in Persian warfare since Thermopylae and Plataea. So Alexander's 50-some-odd thousand guys had the work cut out for him. And of course he knew what he was up against, and he knew what would happen if he tried to just charge in and take on Darius's whole army at once in the middle of his empire. So that's not what he did. Instead, he tried a more roundabout approach, a grand tour of the Achaemenid Empire, if you will. The BS meter for this war story is about a 6 out of 10. We know a lot about the two armies' movements on the way to the battlefield, but it's not clear exactly what happened in the battle itself. Lots of question marks here. No shit, there they were. Alexander knew that any successful invasion would depend on his ability to keep his supply lines open. Because no matter how badass you are, no matter how well-equipped and well-trained your army is, marching into the enemy's country is scary. And if you can't feed your troops or replace their equipment or bring in fresh troops or give them news from home, about the best you can hope for is them to fight less effectively than they would otherwise. And eventually they're going to get tired of your shit and leave, first in onesies and twosies, and then whole units. With a few notable exceptions, if the enemy controls the roads and or the rivers behind you, your army's going to disintegrate around you without ever fighting a battle. Well, Alexander understood that. So the first part of his plan was to make damn sure his army had clear lines of communication back to Macedon and Greece. And to ensure that, he made sure he controlled not only the Hellespont, but the entire Mediterranean coast. He marched down the west coast of Anatolia, fighting the Achaemenids at the Granicus and laying siege to Miletus. He kicked Darius's ass for the first time at Issus in November 333 BCE, supposedly capturing Darius's wife, his mother, and 2 of his daughters. Then he marched down the Levant, besieging Tyre and Gaza, and basically closing all the ports Darius's navy might have used to threaten his rear. Then he finally marched into the Nile Delta, where he built a whole new city right there on the coast. And because he was a man of great humility, he named the new city after himself. You've probably heard of Alexandria. I hear they had a pretty big library there, and a lighthouse too. So that brings us to sometime in the spring of 331 BCE. And finally, his rear secured, Alexander was ready to march into the heart of the Persian Empire, which was still a long way from conquered, because even after 2 major defeats, even after losing a handful of cities and all of his Mediterranean ports, Darius was still the King of Kings, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And he didn't know he was about to take the role of the doomed antagonist in all the history books. He figured he was still the King of Kings, still the baddest motherfucker around, and if he could just win one big fight against this jumped-up flea who thought he was a badass, he could regain control of his empire and finally do what his predecessors hadn't been able to do, bring the Greeks under the Achaemenid umbrella. So Alexander crossed the Euphrates sometime in the summer of 331 BCE, and rather than striking directly east toward Darius' capital of Babylon, he swung north and hugged the mountains as he marched toward the Tigris. It looks like he was planning to march down the north bank of the Tigris toward Babylon. Darius sent a general named Mazaeus with something like 3,000 cavalry to slow his march. And Mazaeus first failed to stop the Macedonians at the Euphrates, then may have done a scorched earth retreat in front of Alexander, in which he would have destroyed or carried away anything the Macedonians could have used on their route of march. And when that failed to stop the Macedonians, Mazaeus apparently just decided the Tigris was uncrossable and didn't bother to even defend it against Alexander's crossing. But Mazaeus gave Darius an idea how Alexander was coming and from what direction, and he gave him time to decide where he wanted to fight. And he chose a broad plain north of the Tigris near the town of Gaugamela. And of course, Alexander did cross the Tigris sometime in September, and that's when he learned where Darius was, about 8 miles away at Gaugamela. And he had his army beaten the ground flat, which told Alexander that's where he meant to fight. And he was planning to use his chariots, which was just fine with Alexander. He would meet Darius at Gaugamela. Not just meet him. Alexander decided to give Darius every advantage, letting him fight on ground he had chosen and giving him plenty of time to prepare. Because Alexander wanted to make it crystal clear to the rest of the world that when he took down Darius once and for all, it wasn't by any clever deception or sneaky tricks. He was going to go toe-to-toe, outnumbered with the King of Kings, and he was going to kick his ass. But Alexander's army had just completed a challenging march, maybe on short rations, and if Darius was flattening ground, he wasn't planning on going anywhere. So Alexander had his army set up camp, and he let him rest for 4 days while Darius prepped his battlefield, which tells us a little about what Alexander must have thought of Darius. Alexander was an extremely aggressive commander, and if he had felt like he needed an advantage, he would have been all over the Persians like a duck on a June bug. So he gave them 4 more days to prepare, and gave his own army 4 days to rest. And the fact that Darius didn't move against the Macedonians in their camp, at least to harass them or kill their foraging parties or something, tells us a little bit about him as well. He was maybe a little timid, and he was probably gun-shy of Alexander after getting his ass kicked at Issus. And he apparently had a dream of maybe copying a famous battle from 70-some-odd years earlier, which was why he was planning on using his chariots and why he'd had Mazaeus destroying crops in front of the Macedonians. But a timid commander is never going to have much success against a guy like Alexander. And by allowing the Macedonians to rest, by allowing Alexander to decide when to engage, Darius surrendered the initiative. Even if they were going to fight on Darius's battlefield, it wouldn't happen until Alexander wanted it to. But maybe Darius wasn't timid. Maybe he was just supremely confident. After all, there's really no way he didn't outnumber Alexander, maybe by as much as 2-to-1. Just like always with ancient warfare, we really have no way of knowing just how many guys Darius brought to the party. Ancient estimates, which usually don't mean much, put it as high as 1 million men, and more modern historians range between about 50 and 200,000. The Macedonians probably had a hair south of 50,000 by this point in the campaign. I'm going to put the Persian numbers somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 90,000, with probably 50,000 infantry plus the 10,000 immortals. They're elite heavy infantry. and about 8,000 Greek mercenaries. They probably had around 1,500 archers. That leaves about 20,000 cavalry. Add 200 Scythe chariots to that. And it looks like Darius had 15 elephants, but for some reason they don't seem to have fought in the battle. But you don't beat a guy like Alexander with numbers alone. Oh, it sure doesn't hurt to outnumber your enemy by 2 to 1, but if your enemy can figure out how to outnumber or overpower you at the exact time and place where it counts the most, at what we call the decisive point, all the numbers in the world won't matter. And in all of military history, there's maybe half a dozen generals who were as good at identifying and hitting the decisive point as Alexander, and none who was better. In fact, he was probably better than Darius at knowing Darius's weak points. And Darius had already learned that the hard way at Issus, and his generals had learned it at the Granicus and in a handful of sieges. So you have to imagine Darius was at least a little bit nervous, even with his numerical advantage. So he was sure to prep his ground and form his men up just so. And it looks like his nerves got the better of him when Alexander and the Macedonians started their approach. See, Alexander didn't want to march his guys 8 miles through the night and then fight a battle the next morning. So around the 30th of September, he picked up his camp and moved it behind a little hill that overlooked the battlefield right across from where Darius planned to line his guys up. So Darius, fearing a night attack, which was a reasonable fear considering that's a pretty popular way for a smaller force to attack a larger, he had his monster-ass army form up so it would be ready. But Alexander had no intention of attacking at night. Remember, he wanted to kick Darius's ass once and for all, and he wanted to do it toe-to-toe, no tricks, no tactics history might label as underhanded or cowardly. But Darius didn't know that, or if he did, he didn't believe it. So while the Macedonians were getting a good night's sleep in their camp, the Persians were standing in ranks waiting for an attack that didn't come. Until morning, that is. Alexander would have lined up his Macedonians in their battle formations in the early morning, probably right around sunrise or a little before, to keep the Persians from attacking his camp. So by the time the sun was fully up, 50,000 Macedonians stood in their ranks, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, facing down roughly a zillion Persians, who stared bleary-eyed back at him. Darius had lined up his troops to take advantage of their inherent strengths. He put his chariots front and center where they could charge and open holes in the Macedonian ranks. Then cavalry in front and on the flanks where it could charge into any holes or weak points created by the chariots. And finally, his infantry behind the cavalry where it could march forward and just roll over whatever was left. Or if worse came to worse, form a line to stop any Macedonian attack that got that far. And he commanded the whole thing from his chariot in the center, surrounded by his cavalry bodyguard and probably with the immortals close at hand. And Alexander lined up his army to account for just that kind of formation. He beefed up his flanks with his cavalry in front of his infantry and angled them back to prevent the Persians from enveloping his line. He positioned himself with the companions a little to the right of his center, planning to command the right wing himself and put his general Parmenion, a stubborn, competent leader he could trust to hold his position, in command of the left. So why couldn't he just command the whole line himself? Because the thing you can't see from battle maps is just how long a line of 50 or 100,000 men was. Darius's line was probably more than 3 miles long, which means if you don't have a radio, they didn't, and if your runners can do a mile in 5 minutes, most of us can't, it takes 8 minutes just to get a guy from the flank to the center where the commander is to make a report. Then the commander has to make a decision, tell the runner his orders back to the commander, and put troops in motion if that's what he needs to do. Then the runner has to run another 8 minutes back to the flank to tell the unit commander there what the boss wants. So you're looking at half an hour or more for the army to react if the guy in the middle wants to micromanage everything. Maybe cut that in half if your messengers are on horseback, but 15 minutes is still too long when you're getting hit. Which means two things. One, you got to have commanders like Parmenion who understand the plan and can play their part without too much direction. And two, these battles took longer to play out than you can see from a movie. Well, the first thing Alexander noticed was that the Persian left flank was lined up a long way past his right, maybe as much as a mile. So he extended his right flank out toward a low hill on that side, trying to avoid an envelopment that could have turned into an encirclement, where the enemy manages to wrap all the way around the flank and attack from the rear. And it must have been a pretty near thing, because it looks like that's where the fight started. The Persian cavalry on the left attacked the Macedonian right, which managed to get into position just in time to make it a scrap rather than a rout. That's partly because the Macedonians fought in what today we would call a combined arms formation, with cavalry in front supported by infantry that could surge forward or to the flanks to deal with penetrations or envelopments as they came up, or form a phalanx the Macedonian cavalry could retreat behind to rest or reform and get ready for their next attack. This fight on the right flank is going to continue in this way for pretty much the whole battle, with the Macedonians holding their own, soaking up damage like the tank in a video game, keeping the Persian left occupied so it couldn't interfere when Alexander started his main attack. As far as I can tell, the Macedonians are the only ones who paired up infantry and cavalry together this closely. And even with all their success, it didn't really catch on. See, there are two problems with pairing infantry with cavalry. The infantry has to run to keep up with the cavalry, and the cavalry has to slow down so they don't outrun their infantry. And the last thing you want is for the cavalry to be too late getting where they need to be, and for the infantry with them to be too exhausted to fight. The Macedonians made it work, but it's a tough balance to get right. And in a minute, we're going to see that even they didn't do it all the time. So back to the battle. At the same time, the cavalry on the Persian left flank was trying to catch the Macedonian right on the back foot, pretty much the same thing was happening on the Macedonian left, where Alexander had left Parmenion in command. And just like on the right, Parmenion's guys were holding their own, fighting as a combined arms force. Well, Darius must have been feeling pretty good about his chances, because now he had both of Alexander's wings pinned in place, and probably thought he didn't have to worry about the Macedonian cavalry anymore. And his main body was still uncommitted, including his chariots, his elite cavalry that he'd kept with him, and most of his infantry, including the immortals we talked about a while ago. The Macedonian infantry with their sarissas were still going to be a tough nut to crack, but his numerical advantage was big enough that he probably figured he could make it happen. And here's where we see the difference a disciplined force of infantry can make on the battlefield. Because the next thing Darius did was send his Scythe chariots forward to scatter the Macedonian infantry. But the infantry had already encountered Scythe chariots at Issus 2 years earlier, and they had a drill for dealing with them. Now, a drill, if you didn't know, is a pre-rehearsed response an army can use to respond to a predictable threat. It's an answer to the question, what do we do if XYZ scenario happens? Modern armies, for example, practice drills for anything from how to move through a particular kind of terrain, to how to respond to an ambush, to what to do if you get attacked by drones. The idea behind a drill is that your 19-year-old soldiers know what to do when shit goes down and their brains stop working because they've gone into fight or flight mode. Because they practiced it so many times they can do it without having to think about it. And the Macedonian infantry had a drill for dealing with Scythe chariots. See, the thing about a chariot is no matter how you configure it, your weapon system is behind your propulsion system. Especially if you want the guys in the back to get into the shit and mix it up, instead of using mobility and standoff to launch javelins and arrows like the Bronze Age chariots we've seen in earlier battles. And as scary as it is to have a horse bearing down on your ass, getting ready to crunch you like yesterday's cornflakes, If you can manage to take one of those horses out, the seats on that chariot just became useless, and the guys in the back just became half-assed infantry. And half-assed infantry is not generally a problem for disciplined infantry. So if you know you're going to be facing seated chariots, you want to train your guys to do what they already want to do. Get the fuck out of the way. The Macedonian infantry just opened up their ranks to give the chariots lanes to run into. Then the guys next to the chariots turned and stuck their spears or maybe their swords into whatever exposed flesh presented itself. You can imagine they probably would have preferred to stick humans rather than horses because people like horses and they're expensive as hell. And part of the drill might have been to cut the harnesses and let them run into the rear where they could be captured. But that's just a guess, and soldiers want to go home when the mission is complete. And if killing a horse is the way to do that, these guys wouldn't have hesitated. Because the whole point of the drill is to take the chariots out of the battle so they can't hurt you anymore. It is just possible that the drill didn't work every time, because some of the sources tell us that a few chariots made it all the way back to the Macedonian camp and found the tent where Darius's mother and wife and daughters were being held, and offered to take them back home and get them out of there. And they refused. It's almost certainly bullshit because it's just too good of a story, and it makes Alexander look even better than he already does, but it's out there, and the story is just too juicy not to pass on. So the chariots were out of the way, with the possible exception of a couple running around loose behind the lines. And Alexander started his phalanx forward. Now, if you're paying attention, you might be scratching your head right now. Alexander is outnumbered. Both flanks are pinned in place and fighting for their lives, and he's sending his infantry forward unsupported to attack a superior force. Yeah, that's what he's doing. Because Alexander was one of the most aggressive battlefield commanders who have ever lived, and his ability to figure out exactly how to hit his enemy's decisive point was damn near supernatural. He didn't send the infantry forward because he thought they could slug it out with the immortals and send them home. I mean, they could have, but their flanks were exposed, and Darius still had some of his cavalry uncommitted. And it's not hard to see that even the Macedonian phalanx would eventually have been encircled and destroyed. But of course, Alexander wasn't sacrificing his infantry. He was making Darius an offer he couldn't refuse. With the Persians' numerical advantage, he was exposing himself to what we call defeat in detail. That's defeating a portion of your enemy's force, then turning your full strength against another portion. If Darius could hold the infantry in place and drive off one of Alexander's wings, he could then turn the force that had just crushed the defeated wing and kick the phalanx in the ass. And Alexander wouldn't be able to do anything about it. He could retreat, or he could watch his army crumble in front of him. And of course, Darius took the bait. But did he have his infantry wait in a disciplined line for the phalanx to cross the field and attack? Did he let the Macedonians do all the work so they would be at least a little bit tired when they got to his lines? Maybe making it that much easier for his guys to deal with the attack? Did he maybe shift his reserve infantry or his cavalry to put them in a position to move against the phalanx's vulnerable flank after it was committed against the frontline infantry? Hell no. He figured Alexander had just made a dumbass rookie mistake, and he smelled victory. He sent his infantry forward to meet the phalanx, which was exactly what Alexander wanted him to do. See, Alexander liked to send his infantry phalanx forward in what's called an echelon formation, where one end of the line is closer to the enemy than the other. This puts a strain on the enemy line, or more accurately, the enemy soldiers, because the few minutes before making contact is one of the hardest times to be a soldier. Before that, you're standing with your buddies talking shit, acting like a badass, pretending you're not in imminent danger of your life. And after contact, you don't have to focus on anything except the enemy in front of you and the orders of your superiors. But in that gap, when you know damn well you're about to be in a fight for your life and you're just praying you're still standing at the end of the day and you don't embarrass yourself in front of your friends, and your brain is making up all kinds of horrible things that could happen in the next few minutes, and the shit your brain comes up with is probably 100 times worse than what's really about to go down, and your heart pounds, and your breathing gets shallow, and your palms get sweaty, and your gut churns, and you're suddenly intensely aware of how fucking hot everything you're wearing is. You can imagine that's not a pleasant feeling. And when the guys down on your left are already in contact and you're not, and you can see the enemy just out of reach in front of you, but you haven't gotten to him yet, or he hasn't gotten to you, it's damn near unbearable. It's enough to make guys surge forward just to close that distance a little bit faster. And that little surge makes the line ragged and scrunches it up as the guys unconsciously angle toward the enemy on the left. That's just a little bit closer. And the guys on the left, the side that's about to hit the enemy, are busy scrunching up to the right, trying to get some part of their bodies behind their neighbor's shields. And if you're not careful, that moment right there, where everybody's scrunching together, can open up gaps in your line. Gaps that don't get closed fast enough because now the guys are focused on the enemies right in front of them. And a skilled commander can take advantage of those gaps. And Alexander was a very skilled commander. And sure enough, the gap he was expecting opened. Somewhere along that infantry line, or more likely on its flank, he found a hole. And that's when the companions showed their worth. Because you remember Alexander was with them on the right flank, which was under attack from at least 2 and probably 3 sides. And when he called them, the companions extricated themselves from what must have been a hard fight, knowing as they did so that guys would probably die because of it, and assembled on him. And they formed up and they got across that field before Darius could do anything about the hole in his lines. And Alexander drove his elite cavalry straight at Darius's chariot. And this is one of the best examples in all of military history of the principle of the decisive point. Yes, numbers make a big difference on the battlefield. But if you find yourself outnumbered on the field and you can figure out how to hit your enemy's decisive point with overwhelming force, your outnumbered army can punch way above its weight class. The decisive point isn't always the enemy commander. It might be, or it might be a key part of the line of battle, or a particular unit, or maybe a strong point, or even the enemy's morale. And if you can identify it and take it down, well, as an old trainer of mine used to say, it ain't Miller time, but you can see it from there. And if you don't understand what Miller time is, go ask somebody my age. And nobody was better than Alexander at identifying the decisive point and hitting it. So when the companions charged Darius in what he thought was a safe position behind the lines, and he turned tail and ran like hell, just like he had at Issus, well, that wasn't the end of the fight, but it just got a lot closer. The first troops to follow Darius' example were probably his reserves, back in the rear where they could see what was going on and didn't have to worry about disengaging themselves from the enemy. Next was probably the infantry, who, even if they outnumbered the Macedonian phalanx, found themselves outclassed pretty quick by the Macedonian sarissas and their iron discipline. And when the rear ranks looked around and saw the army melting away around them, they would have followed suit pretty quick. And panic is contagious in an army. When the guys around you run away, you don't look around and try and find out why. You just haul ass. So the Macedonian infantry found itself master of the field pretty quick. Of course, the cavalry on the flanks was still fighting hard, and in the dust and the noise of battle, they probably hadn't gotten the memo that the fight was over. So Alexander turned the companions around to relieve Parmenion on the left, which has given rise to an unfortunate idea. Unfortunate for Parmenion's reputation, at least, that Alexander was in the process of running down Darius when he got an urgent message from Parmenion that his wing was about to collapse and he needed help. The idea being that if only Parmenion could have held on a little longer, Alexander could have won the war right then and there. And the strong implication is that Parmenion was incompetent, which is kind of a silly idea if you take a minute to think about it. Alexander was pretty good at spotting talent, and idiots didn't last long in positions of command in his army. And Parmenion had served both Philip and Alexander for years with distinction. And the rumors about Parmenion's incompetence seem to have been started by people who had a bone to pick with Parmenion. And even if there's nothing personal or political going on here, let's just think about the facts on the ground. Yes, Alexander was a very aggressive commander, but he was rarely reckless. Even if he had pursued Darius and captured or killed him, his companions would have been exhausted and isolated among the remnants of a very large army. And if any bright-eyed son of a bitch managed to reform anything like a coherent unit, they would have been out of luck, and the Persians would have gotten rid of 2 kings for the price of 1. And Alexander was still deep, deep, deep in territory that could only sort of be called friendly. And to allow a third of his army to go down, even as the price of taking Darius off the board, wouldn't have been very smart. And yeah, Darius was still the king of kings, technically, but Alexander had whipped his ass twice now, and the end of the series probably wasn't that far off. Better to preserve his army for the next fight. So that's a long way of saying I don't buy the idea that Parmenion cost Alexander his chance to take Darius out. Turning back to help him out was the right choice, and Alexander probably didn't hold much of a grudge. Especially because breaking through to relieve him was apparently some of the hardest fighting the companions did that day, being as they were now between the remaining Persians and their escape route. And no matter how big your victory margin is, that is not someplace you want to be. But he relieved Parmenion and saved his army. Then he set some guys looting the Persian camp. And then he went after Darius, who had fled east toward the mountains. He never did catch up with him, and sometime later, as Darius was trying to raise another army so he could keep fighting, a couple of his generals stuck him and left him dying for Alexander to find. So the title King of Kings passed to Alexander, and he just couldn't help himself. He kept going east for 5 more years, his Macedonian army now swollen with Persian troops, trying to conquer his way to the end of the world. And somewhere around the Hyphasis River, called the Bias today in India, he finally had to stop, not because he couldn't fight any farther, but because his guys said it was time to go the fuck home. So he turned back west in 326 BCE and started making plans to keep conquering in that direction. He made it back to Mesopotamia in 324 BCE, but died in Babylon in 323. And that started a whole nother shitstorm that we're not going to get into today. Because now it's time for our scorecard. So a reminder, each principle is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. First one is mass. This is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point of the battlefield. Alexander takes this one in a walk. His ability to identify his enemy's critical point, expose it, and hit it was just damn near supernatural, as I've said before. And driving his companions against Darius at the climax of the battle is maybe one of the best examples of that ability. Darius, for his part, seems to have been counting on his numbers to overwhelm Alexander all along his line. So Alexander here gets a 5. Darius gets a 2. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. You could never accuse Alexander of fighting defensively. Pretty much all of his victories came when he seized the initiative and launched a decisive attack. Gaugamela was no exception. But Darius was no slouch here either. It's just that his early attacks weren't enough to overcome the Macedonian phalanx or pin the companions in place to keep Alexander from maneuvering. So Alexander once again gets a 5, and Darius gets a 4. Surprise. Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. Alexander takes this one for sure. First, for sending his infantry forward without his cavalry, and then for the decisive charge with the companions. But up until that happened, he pretty much played by the book. in fact choosing not to launch a night attack against Darius's superior numbers. Darius, for his part, doesn't seem to have had that much interest in surprise at all, preferring to overwhelm the Macedonians with his superior numbers. So Alexander gets a 4 on this one. Darius gets a 1. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. Alexander did what he was supposed to do here, angling his flanks back and making it look like he was going to fight a defensive battle. But then he threw security away when he let his infantry pull away from his wings. Darius, on the other hand, had plenty of reserves to flex toward trouble spots, and he should have had plenty of security, but he just flat failed to secure his own position in the line. So they both get a 3 on this one. Maneuver. This is your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. Again, Alexander has the advantage here. He adjusted his plan on the fly as he extended his line to the right at the outset of the battle. And pretty much everything that happened after that point was because he made it happen. Darius's blunt force approach probably would have worked against most opponents, but it wasn't really what you'd call maneuver. More like hitting your enemy with a big-ass hammer until he can't fight anymore. So Alexander's going to get a 4 here. And Darius is going to get a 2. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. Both missions were pretty clear, or at least they seem to have been. Alexander was there to take down Darius and at least give him a good spanking, and preferably capture or kill him. Darius was there to crush the Macedonian army, and if possible, to take Alexander off the board so he could have his kingdom back. So they both get a 4 here. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. Both sides seem to have been crystal clear on who was in command. The Macedonians' morale was higher than the Persians, but I think that was because Alexander hadn't lost a battle, not because of any uncertainty of who was in charge. So they both get a 5 here. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. I think Darius's plan was simpler than Alexander's. Hit him from 3 sides and squash him like a bug. Alexander, on the other hand, had a lot of moving parts, and his decisive charge required him to move fast to take advantage of the hole he expected to open in the Persian lines, and for that hole to be open all the way to Darius. So Alexander's going to come out of this one with a 3, and Darius gets a 4. Economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. Darius, as we've talked about already, had plenty of reserves. He could afford to attack all along the Macedonians' line and still have fresh troops to plug into any trouble spots. Alexander did well to keep his guys back from the battlefield so they could get a good night's sleep, but when the fighting started, he was pretty much all in. So Alexander's going to get a 3 here, and Darius gets a 4. So the total scores, Alexander's going to end up with a 36. And Darius is going to come out with a 29. So Darius actually comes out with a respectable score, which, to be honest, I didn't expect when I started this war story. It's just not enough to overcome Alexander's legendary talents. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And please tell your friends about me, especially the one you're thinking about right now. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.